Hey everybody, welcome. Is the volume okay on this microphone? Okay, great. Awesome. My name is Liberty and I'm part of the Firestorm Collective, and we're really pleased to be able to do this event today with all of y'all and with some great speakers. Just a couple little housekeeping things. If you find that you need to use the bathroom while you're here, there is one available on the other side of the building, down the little hall. If the light's off, the light will come on as you step out. If you at any point need to step outside and get some air, it's kind of nasty outside, but please feel free to get up and stretch and walk around and do whatever you need to do to feel all right. And there is a door both behind you over here on the left, your left, and then also probably the door you came in on. So we're really pleased that you're here tonight. Firestorm is a 16-year-old cooperative run by a queer feminist collective here in Asheville, North Carolina. And we do a lot of events, and maybe you've been to some of them. We are still figuring out how to do events that are both in person and online. So this event, in addition to being an in-person experience, is also being streamed over YouTube. So we may have some folks joining us there, which is great. Apologies to folks who are joining remotely if any of this is a little bit rough. We're open to getting more feedback on the setup. Great, so I want to go ahead and introduce our speakers today, starting with Jessica, who really made this happen by approaching us about doing an author event. Jessica Pishko is a journalist and a lawyer with a JD from Harvard Law School and an MFA from Columbia University. She has been reporting on the criminal legal system for a decade with a focus on the political power of sheriffs since 2016. In addition to her newsletter, her writings have been featured in the New York Times, Politico, Rolling Stone, The Atlantic, The Appeal, Slate, and Democracy Docket. She's been awarded journalism fellowships from the Pulitzer Center and Type Investigations, and was a 2022 New America Fellow, a longtime Texas resident. She currently lives here in Asheville, which is lucky for us. And actually, is anybody holding a copy? Do you have a copy of your book with you here? So Jessica's book, the highest law on the land, is up front.
Here it is.
Okay, great.
Thank you, sir.
There are copies of this new title that Jessica has written that are available for purchase.
And I can sign after.
Yes, and sign, you can get one from. Okay, in addition, we're really honored to have Dulce Morales here with us today. Dulce worked with Compañeros Inmigrantes de las Montañas en Acción, which you may know as CIMA. CIMA is an organization passionately dedicated to addressing the political social context of the Latin immigrant community through community defense, outreach, and education. CIMA seeks to create an integrated, informed, and prepared community in which people take care of each other and build collective power. And so today we're going to be talking about deportations, and particularly the incoming administration's threat of mass deportations, with a focus on our local context, but I think some lessons that will be relevant to people tuning in from anywhere. So big round of applause, please, for our speakers. Thanks so much, Jill.
Muchas gracias a todos por estar aquí. Es esperanzador ver otras personas, no solamente de mi comunidad, que están en apoyo hacia nuestra comunidad latina. Como escuchaban dentro de la introducción, nuestra organización lleva haciendo este trabajo de defensa con los derechos de los inmigrantes ya casi 24 años. Y no les voy a contar toda la historia de lo que se han hecho, pero sí puedo contar lo que hicimos el año pasado con respecto a la HB10. Tuvimos una reunión con el sheriff y la comunidad, en donde la comunidad latina tuvo la oportunidad de expresar sus miedos, sus preguntas, sus preocupaciones. También tuvimos protesta contra la HB10 porque es un bill o una ley que separa familias, que criminaliza a nuestra comunidad. Me distraí un poquito. También nuestro trabajo es educar a nuestra comunidad y mantenerlos informados acerca de todas las leyes que nos afectan. Hace un ratito platicaba con Jessica acerca de las leyes federales que están saliendo como la HR 29, la S5, que son leyes que criminalizan mucho a nuestra comunidad. Donde el común denominador de estas leyes es decir, oh, si creemos que eres indocumentado y que estás cometiendo un delito o que alguien dijo que eres sospechoso de cometer ese delito, vas a ser procesado. Y eso hace creer que están removiendo las manzanas malas, pero no es cierto, porque realmente no sabemos cómo va a ser, cómo está siendo una situación en casa. La HB10 quita la protección a personas víctimas de violencia o que hayan sido testigos de un delito. Y eso genera muchísimo miedo en la comunidad. Y pienso en aquellas mujeres e incluso hombres, porque está muy generalizado que las mujeres solamente somos víctimas de violencia, pero también hay hombres. Entonces, nuestra comunidad siente miedo, pero también a través de lo que ha pasado con el N, pudimos comprender que si nos mantenemos todos juntos, si nos cuidamos los unos a los otros, pudimos con un huracán, seguramente vamos a poder con lo que sea que traiga esta nueva administración. Ha traído mucho odio, eso sí, pero también, siendo positivos, nos ha dejado ver el amor de vecinos que se preocupan por sus mejores amigos, por los amigos de sus hijos. Entonces, agradezco a todos los que nos han apoyado y que dicen, aquí estoy para ti como tu buen vecino, porque todos somos humanos y merecemos un buen lugar en donde vivir y ser parte de esta sociedad. Y no estoy de acuerdo con que algunas personas estén bien, con que nosotros trabajemos en sembrando, trayendo la comida a la mesa, haciendo los trabajos duros, muy mal pagados a veces. Eso sí está bien para el gobierno, pero entonces no está bien seguir viviendo aquí. Eso es de lo que no estamos de acuerdo. Pero también CIMA va a estar listo cuando estas cosas empiecen a pasar. Y no lo vamos a hacer solos porque tenemos muchos voluntarios verificadores que van a estar ahí de la mano con nosotros. Y agradezco a Jessica por darme este espacio de poder hablar sobre la situación de nuestra comunidad. Ahora le paso el micrófono a ella, porque si no voy a tomar mucho tiempo.
Thank you. I want to say thank you so much. I'm so glad to do this because I think that it's best to partner law and analysis, right? Like, the book is long and it has a lot of history and law and analysis, but I think it is important to pair that with action and the people who are most impacted and how everybody can help. So I'm really grateful that we could do this. And thank you, Liberty, very grateful that we have the space. So thanks to everyone for being here. I think what I'm going to do, just checking the time, so we have lots of time for questions. I think what I'm gonna do first is back out a little, talk a little bit. Wait, I gotta turn this talk a little bit about sheriffs generally. And since that's the topic of the book and the history, I'll focus a bit on immigration. And then we'll kind of end up back where we started, which is a lot of the current bills and laws that are being passed. So sort of like how we got to where we are right now. So one of the things I spent quite a lot of time on in the book is talking about the history of sheriffs and why they have ever become involved in things like immigrations and deportations, right? And kind of what does it mean that we have this political figure and in many states, right? An important political figure, right? And they say, I think the last study was that in North Carolina, some 60–70% of people knew the name of their sheriff more than they knew the name of their senators. So there's some argument to say that in certain places, right, the sheriff is a very, very important figure, especially in more rural areas, especially places in the South and the West. And you know, when you look at the history of sheriffs, I think it's important to see that they've always been both a manager of empire, right? So sort of this idea of deciding what exactly is the United States, like what does the United States look like, how big is it, where's the border, as well as deciding who is or isn't a citizen of the United States. So I talk about that in a few different ways, right? And a lot of, the first one that always comes to mind is things like convict leasing, which was an activity that was really popular after the Civil War. So sheriffs were the primary figures. They would, in essence, arrest Black people, usually mostly Black men, for things like loitering, petty theft, other types of what we would call sort of small crimes, petty crimes, and then send them to work. And this was not just working in the field, but was working in many industries, in mines, in the Everglades, mining tar, in factories.
Building railroads.
Building railroad, yes.
Locally.
Also, so really like every industry there was this, you know, sort of class of labor that was treated almost, and a lot of people, I think the subtitle of a famous book, right, is worse than slavery. I mean, and people were treated very, very poorly. It really can't be emphasized just how bad the conditions were for a lot of people. It was also, of course, confusing because there was no definitive end to the sentence, right? So when we think about, as sometimes we are talking today, right, about laws that are confusing on purpose, and that part of the intent of the law is to confuse people and make them worry about, you know, are they free or are they not free, right? When is it over? When do I get to go home? And I think that that's one of the other practices of something like convict leasing, right, that transitions to today. The idea that people didn't know when they were done, right? And sometimes they would sort of say, oh, well, you're almost done, but we need to add some time because you committed maybe a crime, or maybe because you needed to buy something, or because of the cost of your food, et cetera. So this is something I think with a long history. And the other thing sheriffs did a lot in the West, right, was participate in westward expansion. This is something I talk about a little more in the book because I felt like it's been undercovered, was the role of how the United States used law enforcement to create empire. Right? We don't talk about that as much because I think we don't always think about the fact that, you know, the United States grew, it took over territory that other people were living on. It removed people from that territory. And, you know, I think history teaches us that that was a good thing overall. Like, most people don't say it was a bad thing today, but I think it's worth thinking about the fact that they were agents of empire. And one of the things that made the sheriff really important was there was a president named Andrew Jackson. He was president in the 1840s and 50s. And if he's familiar to you, it's because he was one of the people who was like the primary perpetrator of genocide against Native Americans. He came into office, he was a soldier, he was a farmer, He believed that the United States should take over more land to the west. The other interesting thing that feels relevant to this time is that he was also a populist. He believed he had a mandate from his voters to expand the United States empire and to create more land. Wait, you have a question?
Are there any parallels between the elements of what Andrew Jackson has done versus what Donald Trump is doing today?
So I hesitate to make too many parallels only because I'm not an expert. But I will say that's interesting about him is that Andrew Jackson relied a lot on economic populism was something he believed in. And by that, he meant he wanted to expand the franchise of voting to all white men. So before this time of what's called Jacksonian democracy, most white men couldn't vote either, right? So women couldn't vote, anyone of color couldn't vote, but many white men could not vote either. And one of the innovations that Andrew Jackson had was to enable all white men to vote, right? He had a really interesting connection to sort of white workers, white farmers. And he thought that those people were really important because those were the people who would expand the empire, right? So those were a lot of the people who moved west, right? And participated in westward expansion. Now, of course, it was also deeply racist, right? It was only white men, but he also had this idea that more offices should be elected. And this is where we get to things like elected sheriffs. So they weren't not necessarily elected sheriffs before that, but he had, as more white men could vote, they made the offices of sheriff and a lot of other local offices elected. And so I think that maybe the parallel I would draw that's interesting is this idea of combining economic populism with white supremacy, which is something that I think Trump and the Republican Party have done, right? That's what they did to win the election, really. But I think that that's important to know why the sheriff became elected. And because the country at that time was very warlike, so there were lots of wars, wars fighting against Native Americans, Spanish-American War. And so you had a lot of soldiers at the time who didn't have jobs. You had unemployed soldiers, and so a lot of them became either sheriffs or kind of parts of the sheriff's posse. So sheriffs always were more warlike, more militaristic, because a lot of the people who took that job were people who had previously been fighting in wars. And so, especially in the West, where there was less established law enforcement, a lot of places in the Northeast had the early forms of law enforcement, like watchmen rang bells. In South Carolina, of course, their police came from slave catchers. And sheriffs were a little bit different from that, I think, because they came from this military background and were very militia oriented, right? Which I think leads to why they have this affinity with militia groups today. Now, sheriffs really didn't become involved in immigration, except in terms of housing people. So I first want to say the important thing about sheriffs is that one, they're elected, and they're elected in the county, and two, they run the jail. And because they run the jail, so they run everything that happens inside the jail, like how people are housed, what kind of visits they have, do they use family visits, or do you do it on the iPad, what kind of food people eat, everything that happens is controlled by the sheriffs. And because sheriffs have this ability to, in essence, control a group of people who are captive in the jail, right? So people in jail they're not going anywhere. Because of that, they become a really important player in immigration enforcement, largely because they have people who have been arrested in a place where everybody knows where they are. And so it becomes easier, right? So in the 90s, when the war on drugs was ramping up, the US government decided it would be easy to involve sheriffs in jails because one of their ideas, like today, was that immigrants were causing drug crimes. They were selling drugs, they were importing drugs, and just like now, right, there was this uniting of immigrants, particularly immigrants coming at the US-Mexico border, and criminality, right? This a false impression that people immigrating across the US-Mexico border were in some way involved in crimes. And their idea was that, well, if sheriffs know who's in jail, they can arrest people, and then they're in the jail, and then they can help ICE, and before ICE was so before we had the current system of DHS, it was a different department. They said, well, they can help us by keeping these people and then transferring them to us for deportation. And it really got ramped up during the Obama administration. So I think one important thing is that the Obama administration, and honestly, Joe Biden also created a very, very large deportation machine that we now have for Donald Trump to use, right? It was created to be very large with a lot of different pieces. And Obama created a system called secure communities. And secure communities is kind of like a big database. It takes biometric markers, so it takes fingerprints. So if you are booked into jail, some of you hopefully have not been booked into jail, but what happens if you're booked into jail is they take your fingerprint and they run you through a system to see if you have other open warrants. So maybe you have like an unpaid ticket somewhere, or you didn't appear somewhere. So they look to see if you have an open warrant. They also look to see, let's say, are you on a FBI wanted list or something like that. And then they also look to see, are you in the Department of Homeland Security's database as a person who might have been deported, was not supposed to come back, or are you a person who's been flagged as potentially deportable, right? And I use the term to potentially deportable because there's a lot of different people. I don't like the word undocumented because there's a lot of different people in this category. So some people might be DACA, some people might be waiting for a green card. They might be spouses of US citizens who are eligible for their green card. They just haven't gotten it yet. There might be adopted children who just haven't had their paperwork filed. So it's a lot of different groups of people who are like potentially deportable, depending on who you ask. And so that database really allowed, basically it's ICE in every jail, right? As soon as someone is booked into jail, they might get flagged by ICE. And this happens in different ways in different places. So some places have an ICE agent inside the jail who just looks at who comes in and checks. There are some jails with what's called a 287G agreement, which you guys have probably heard of because we don't have one here in Buncombe County anymore. Henderson has one, and I know Alamance does. Yeah, so a few counties around here still have 287G agreements. And those are voluntary agreements, so you don't have to participate, which is why a demand has been to not participate, because you don't have to participate. It doesn't bring any money to the sheriff's office. It actually just enables deputies to get trained as ICE agents. It's actually not totally clear what they get trained as. They're trained by ICE. Like ICE trains them. It's not, they don't ask like lawyers, immigration lawyers to train them. They're trained by ICE. I mean, from the gist of it, in most places, what they basically do is just ask people if they're citizens. It's my understanding. They ask people if they're citizens. They can do additional questioning, like, are you DACA or something like that? And then they can decide, okay, I think this person might be potentially deportable, and then put them in, call ICE and say, can you, it just basically like, call ICE, can you pick this person up? We think they're potentially deportable. And some places don't have 287G agreements, but get around it. Information about jail bookings is public, so anybody can look at jail bookings. So, you know, if an ICE office wants to, they can look at jail bookings to see, are people being booked into jail that they think should be taken into custody or deported. In some places, sheriffs call, you know, if they book someone, they might call ICE and say, we have this person, we think that they're deportable, do you want to come pick them up? So usually what happens is ICE will come and pick that person up and transfer them to ICE custody. which might or might not be in the same jail. So the second way sheriffs are largely involved is that they sign ISGA, what's called an ISGA agreement. It's just an agreement to rent out part of the jail to ICE. I know Alamance has one, Henderson's is not, another county. There's like 2 or 3 counties in North Carolina that have them. But that's basically the jail gets paid a per diem fee to keep people for ICE. And different jails do this differently. So some jails have a separate section for people being held for ICE. Some jails don't. It kind of depends on how the sheriff feels like doing it. But we do know that, I mean, and then there are separate private prisons that are used for ICE detention. So there's like a variety of facilities that ICE uses to detain people. Sometimes they're far away, so there's not always a guarantee if someone goes into ICE detention that they'll be close to their family. They might get sent somewhere else. And we also know at this point that overall detention is bad. Like jail is bad for people, which I can talk extensively for a very long time about why it's bad. Jail is very bad, detention is very bad, health care is bad, access to services is bad. It's unhealthy. People, I mean, and I think understated when I sometimes point out to people is it's also it's very uncomfortable. Like you don't have like your socks or your blanket or whatever. You don't get to call your kids and say, I can't pick you up today. You don't get to call, nobody knows where you are usually. And so it's really, I think, really disorienting and confusing for people. In addition to being, the food is gross, it's cold, it's hot, it's dirty, you don't get to go home and get your medicine, or all sorts of things like that. And plus, we just know now that confining people like that is just unhealthy. There's just nothing good about it. And any of that, there's no good reason, there's not a good reason to do it, and there's nothing good about it. In particular, a lot of ICE detention facilities have had huge issues with healthcare. And to clarify, I think, which is also important, is that when people are in ICE detention, they haven't been accused, they're not there because of a crime. ICE detention is supposed to be civil. So if you are in deportation proceedings, that's a civil proceeding. Now that means different things. One of the problems with that is it means you're not guaranteed a lawyer because it's not a criminal proceeding. On the flip side, they're not supposed to hold people in detention because it's a civil proceeding. You're not there because you've committed a crime, although you are there. You are there because you committed a crime, but you're not there because you committed a crime. And so technically, right, there should be a presumption of release, which is what we have right now, is a presumption that people who are in ICE detention should be released pending their hearing because they're not there because they committed a crime, although this is something that is changing because of might change because of the new federal law. So I'm just moving on from sheriffs, but anyway, so there's 2 new laws here that impact people that you already talked about, right? There's HB 10, which, to say one thing, is that it was a great success and it took them 10 years to pass it. They tried and tried and tried to pass this law, and to say it delayed and delayed and delayed was, it was because people didn't want this law. And it's a little interesting, so sometimes I point this out about sheriffs, that there's, I think, 95 counties in North Carolina, so 95 different sheriffs, and only 5 counties have something like 3/4 of the people. So and all 5 of those counties, as far as I know, they're all sanctuary jurisdictions. They're all jurisdictions that don't have 287G, they don't cooperate with ICE, or I would say they do their best not to. Sometimes it's inevitable. But to say that is from saying that HB 10 is far from like the will of the people. The people didn't want HB 10. The most populous jurisdictions didn't want HB 10, but it's foisted upon the state by, the 90 rural sheriffs that wanted HB 10. Technically, HB 10 shouldn't change much about what sheriffs do. what HB 10 basically says is that if ICE issues a detainer for people in certain, who have committed certain categories of crimes, and most of those are categories of crimes like assault or domestic violence, or I think DUIs, but I think it's multiple DUIs. That those sheriffs must honor those detainers. So detainers is just a request to hold people. It's supposed to be only for 48 hours. And if ICE doesn't pick them up in 48 hours, you're supposed to let them go. Now, detainers are in flux because it's not clear if you're supposed to honor them or not. HB 10 was intended to force some of the sheriffs to honor detainers. Obvious that that's all it was. And just to punish sheriffs who said they didn't want to cooperate with ICE. Now, it's not clear how that's going to impact a lot that's going on. Charlotte has said they haven't had anyone put into deportation because of HB 10. I don't think Buncombe has either, but we don't know if it, in conjunction with the Trump administration, will it be used as an excuse to do something? I don't know. My personal theory is it's an excuse to harass the more populous jurisdictions who don't want to cooperate with ICE. And if they don't honor a detainer and that particular individual, say, is arrested elsewhere, that's where sheriffs will get upset, is they'll say like, oh, well, Buncombe released this person they weren't supposed to release or something like that. So that's what I think is probably going to happen, but it's sort of hard to say. The federal legislation, it's called the Lake and Riley Act. It's named after a young lady who was brutally murdered. It was a terrible crime. But this is a very bad, you would probably agree. I would say it's a very, very bad legislation that's getting passed on the federal level. Now, the good thing is it's federal legislation. It can't require local sheriffs to do anything. So nothing sheriffs do should change. So if the sheriff says I have to do X, Y, Z because of Lake and Riley, no, they don't have to do anything different because of Lake and Riley. Lake and Riley only impacts ICE. So it says that people arrested or accused of a certain list of crimes that includes like shoplifting or theft. So it's a bunch of like what we would call like non-violent. Expanding the category of crime. Those individuals, it says that ICE has to issue a detainer and that ICE has to hold them. So they have to go into ICE detention. Now, ICE actually doesn't like this bill either. So you know it's bad if ICE doesn't like it. I said they don't like it because they estimate the number of people they would have to detain as like an extra 100,000 people. And they say they don't have the space and they don't have the manpower and they don't want to do it. So it's unclear exactly how this will happen. I think, so one of the things I think that Donald Trump has done, and then I'll open up to questions. I think Donald Trump has done something which is to create like a lot of fear and confusion by having different laws that say different things that people don't know. So if you're arrested for shoplifting, does that mean you're going to get deported, right? Like it's to make people feel confused. He's also blending a lot of stuff that's interior with stuff on the US-Mexico border. So he's kind of mixing up like people who have recently crossed the US-Mexico border, which is like a different group of people than people who are here, living here and working here, who might potentially get arrested and potentially deported. So, and then that sort of gets mixed up with things like ICE raids on workplaces, checkpoints, right? It all sort of gets like mixed up into like one big thing on purpose, right? So whenever they talk about like some of these laws, like the Lake and Riley Act, they always show footage of the US-Mexico border, which is like, it's not related to that law. It has nothing to do with it. Nevertheless, it's to make people feel afraid and also to, pander to his base, make people feel afraid. What I do know and can say with some confidence is that there's a number of sheriffs across the country who are excited. They like enforcing immigration law, or at least they like saying they're enforcing immigration law. A lot of them, a lot of them are in places that are not as populous. What that does create though is a situation where it's hard for people to drive from county to county, right? So if people are trying to go places, go to work, go to see their family, travel, it creates like a patchwork of laws where it's not clear if people will or won't be. If people are arrested in different counties, they don't know what will happen. Which, you know, it always was, I think, confusing and people didn't know what would happen, but now it's sort of worse. So I was gonna say if people wanna ask questions, particularly about sheriffs. Do you wanna add anything right now?
Yes.
Okay, you add it. Do you wanna get your thing set up?
I can talk a little bit. Solo me gustaría agregar que todas estas propuestas de ley y lo que se dice en papel que deberían de ser todos estos biles, como lo dije hace un rato, terminan siendo quizá una excusa o un empoderamiento para todas esas fuerzas de ley como los state troopers que son a nivel federal, que no son, quiero decirlo, no quería decirlo así, pero que son racistas, a llevar a personas que su único delito es no tener una licencia para manejar. Y con eso les basta para poder llevar a alguien a la cárcel y poner, oh, quizá es un sospechoso, porque sabemos que lo han hecho. Y hace un rato le mostraba a Jessica una detención que no era tan legal. Esto pasó el viernes pasado, este viernes, de una persona de 24 años que no llevaba las luces encendidas a las 5:58 de la mañana y no licencia. No había rastro de alcohol, no había un delito por robo, no había nada más que, oh, no lleva sus luces encendidas, entonces me lo llevo. Y creemos encima que esto va a suceder y que en Buncombe el sheriff en algún punto va a tener que hacer la ley HB10, pero que quizá para nosotros como comunidad no sea el problema o no es, la autoridad no es la ley, sino la forma en que crean estas leyes para causar mucha injusticia. Esto a la vez va a traer más vulnerabilidad, más problemas para nuestra comunidad. Estamos creyendo que va a haber incremento de robo en áreas en donde la comunidad latina vive. Ha sucedido. Y la policía ha mandado un mensaje muy incorrecto a nuestra comunidad, porque hubo un caso en donde la comunidad pudo agarrar a las personas que estaban yendo a robar de noche. Llamaron a la policía llegó y dijo, necesitan soltarlos, porque no sabemos si son quienes vinieron a robar antes. Las personas enseñaron el video, es que son sus cuerpos. Oh, pero no podemos ver sus caras, entonces necesitas dejarlos ir. Entonces, la ley se aplica para alguien que no tiene una licencia para manejar, pero no se está aplicando para personas que van a ir a robar, que eran personas blancas. Entonces, esto crea más inseguridad para nuestra comunidad, mucho más miedo, pero mucho más cosas injustas para nuestra comunidad trabajadora. Eso es lo que quería agregar, que en papel ellos pueden decir que son leyes justas, pero en la realidad lo que se aplica, hay mucha injusticia. Nosotros como ciudadanos quizá podamos ir con el departamento de sheriff en Henderson aquí y preguntar, oye, ¿de cuántas personas que has deportado? ¿Puedes mostrarme cuántos de esos realmente tenían un delito que era altamente castigable? Porque personas que trafican mayormente no son deportados porque se quedan en la cárcel por años hasta cumplir su sentencia. Y quizá cuando salgan y paguen su deuda, ya no tengan un momento político tan anti-inmigrante y puedan seguir en el país. Entonces, las injusticias suceden a través de estos biles anti-inmigrantes.
I would agree. I agree. It all comes down to how it's being enforced. And because we have there's 18,000 different law enforcement agencies in the United States. So there's like state troopers, there's the sheriff's office, there's city police, and each officer gets to sort of decide how they want to enforce it. And in particular, we know that sheriffs in particular, because they are elected, take it upon themselves to enforce laws basically how they feel like it. They're very influenced by politics. I always say that it's interesting because cops are sort of they're all like a lobbyist, right? They all trying to think how to say. They all not only do a job, like they say they're sort of doing a job, but they're also like telling you what they believe in and what they represent when they do it. It's not like a neutral job, and it's also like most people's it's also most people's like the person from the government you're most likely to see and have contact with is going to be police. So, and I think that it's hard, and we are in a moment where a lot of other criminal justice reforms are being rolled back, like North Carolina just rolled back the age at which you charge young people as adults. And so it's all kind of coming together to create an atmosphere where there's just, a high appetite for punishment. And that has included like a high appetite to demonize immigrants, make immigrants seem bad, and again, everything is, even for things, I think so right now, the most common crime that most people are deported for is a DUI style stuff, that's the most common, but if you think about how many people commit DUIs, I think even those you could say are very unjust. I used to know a place where cops would go to where the Latinx bars were, so like where people go after work and then they would just sit outside the bar and then wait for people to get in their car to go home so they could arrest them. So these are sort of checkpoint style. It's like stopping lots of people, stopping people going to work, stopping people going to school, and I think that's where the community defense comes in, because that's something at least people can be aware of. Yeah.
I've done a little bit of independent research to see like how authoritarianism really kind of right is, and one of the most common features I've noticed is basically a gradual legal encroachment on civil rights. How can we, as everyday citizens, counter that?
Can you repeat it one more time a little louder?
One of the most common features I see in emergent authoritarianism is a gradual legal encroachment against civil rights. How can we as everyday citizens counter that?
If you can repeat the question, just so that we capture it.
Oh, he asked about authoritarian governments and encroachment of civil rights. I don't know if I feel like qualified. I don't know if I feel qualified enough to answer that question. I'll answer it in the limited way that I can. Which is to say that one of the things I talk in the book about is that sheriffs are being very much dragged, running to the right. And that what I have seen lately is that many, many law enforcement officers also are all moving to the right. By which I mean a substantial number of them voted for Trump and believe in a lot of things that Trump says, right? That's sort of a nice way of saying like a lot of them are becoming more xenophobic and racist. And this is just what I've seen, like they have moved towards kind of viewing, being extremely xenophobic, towards wanting more use of force. That's something that I think is really important to the Trump administration right now, honestly, is just to like allow greater use of force by a lot of law enforcement officers. So they want that, they want less responsibility. I mean, everybody always wants less responsibility, but they sort of want less responsibility. And they're very much in favor of things like civilian gun ownership, opposing things like, I mean, one of the things I noticed just in the course of reporting the book was like a decreased interest in investigating and dealing with domestic violence, which is something became deeply concerned about in the course of reporting, that police had seen for a long time domestic violence as something that they could like arrest people for, which is something police always like. But what I have seen is that they have started to discount domestic violence. So a lot will say like, oh, it's not serious, or they don't know, or they don't mean. Now, what that translates to in every day sometimes is that means like more likely to arrest both people. So if two people are fighting, police are more likely to arrest both and say like, oh, well, they're both like, maybe he hit her and she threw something at him, or, you know, something like that. And they'll arrest both and say, oh, well, they're both committing violence, they're both domestic abusers, right? And then both of them got arrested and treated the same, even though the power dynamic is not the same, right, is sort of the problem. And you see this in things like women who defend themselves against like abusive partners who end up in jail or prison because they're defending themselves. Like there's a lot of inequities there, but I do think that this is something that's getting like increasing, like this sort of intense misogyny. And of course, like that's all tied to things like all the policing and attacks on the LGBTQ community, right? Especially the trans community. I think that's something that's pretty obvious in most areas, but that's obvious in terms of law enforcement as well. And I think a third category where people are very punitive is in the area of protesters. So what I have seen is there are more punitive laws right now allowing people to arrest protesters. I think that they're very willing to arrest protesters. There's a huge push, particularly people protesting genocide. They have a huge push to arrest people who are protesting genocide, especially anyone who might not be a citizen. I have a theory that one of the goals is to try to deport protesters who might fall in that category. So I do think like protest is another area where it's important. The Lake and Riley Act explicitly includes a provision that they have to hold you and detain you if you are accused of assault on an officer. If you've heard, so assault on an officer is a pretty broad, it's a pretty broad category. Most of the time it happens because, especially in protests or other big situations, because they push you. So cops' strategy in a protest is to push and kettle people into a small compact area. And so sometimes people then put their hand out so they don't fall or something. Like usually it's a situation where you're putting your hand out because you're gonna trip and fall. And so you put your hand out and you touch a cop. Someone said it was like if you cough on a cop, which is not that far from the truth. It's really like anytime you like put your hand out and touch, like do something like that, which is pretty natural for most people, but that's another category they added, and I feel like that's a category very much designed at protesters. Because that's like a typical thing that people do naturally do in a protest is like that, so they don't fall. Oh yes, please.
Well, I'm curious I appreciate that you highlighted the critical role that democratic administrations have played in creating the infrastructure for mass deportation. I'm curious how successful Trump was in his first term at pursuing deportations, and if he was not entirely successful, if you could reflect on maybe some of the things that contributed to, you know, basically what were the strategies that contributed to slowing or blocking deportations during the first administration?
Yeah, so one of the things about, oh, sorry, I just want to repeat the question. So the question was about Trump 1.0 and how successful that was at deportations and what strategies worked. So one of the things that's interesting about Trump the first, is that they were not successful in deportations. want to say, first of all, there were things like the Muslim ban, right, and people at the airport, so there were a lot of like bad things that happened, I don't want to say like nothing bad happened. A lot of very bad things that happened, notably things like the Muslim ban, notably a lot of propaganda around immigrants, particularly any immigrants of color. And so that was definitely there. And Trump, one, also had hired Tom Homan. So Tom Homan has been rehired as the quote unquote border czar, which is not like a real job, so I don't know. Mostly what Tom Homan, I mean, I will say this, Tom Homan is a very, very mean person, so in researching the book, I've researched quite a lot about Tom Homan, and he is not a nice guy. He, he's not very nice, he would deport anybody, like he would deport like his own child, he's like that. And so during the first Trump administration, there was actually a lot of like back and forth between people like Tom Homan and Stephen Miller, who wanted to do more deportations faster, and other people inside the administration who were pushing back, and quite frankly, a lack of resources and organization. So one of the reasons why Trump perhaps didn't deport as many people. I mean, Biden this year deported many, many more people than Trump ever deported. He deported the highest since, I think, Obama's peak. So it was a lot, you know, I think it was 400, 500,000? I think so, 500,000. Yeah, like right around that number, so close to 500,000. So that's a lot. And so to bear in mind that like a lot of people are sort of always being deported. Trump did much less than that, but I largely actually chalk it up to like kind of like a lack of administrative competence, because he was like doing different things. And I think some of that will be the same now, like one of the like ICE, for example, doesn't like the Blake and Riley Act. Like one of the reasons is that ICE is limited in terms of like capacity and personnel. They just can't go everywhere. And people don't get picked up by ICE sometimes because ICE doesn't feel like it, like they just don't want to do it. And so some of that, you know, will of course be an issue. There are limits in terms of personnel, right? I don't want to say like, and the problem with that is honestly it creates almost like more anxiety because you don't know when will they decide to do it, when will they be lazy and not want to get in the van, and when will they not be lazy. And some of that depends on like the local office in Charlotte. The closest ICE office is in Charlotte, so like what does the Charlotte office want to do? And you don't know, because it's whatever that person, whoever's in charge feels like doing that day. And so I think there's some of that. Now, one of the important points of resistance in Trump 1 was the resistance of a lot of more like, I like to call them progressive, like the quote unquote progressive minded law enforcement and sheriffs, right? And that was really important, especially around 2018, like in North Carolina, when groups of progressive minded sheriffs got elected who said they would not cooperate with ICE. So they didn't honor detainers. They exited the 287G agreement. And this was a big deal in North Carolina because North Carolina was like the poster child for 287G, really. Like 287G started in North Carolina, and so it was like their baby, really. And so this was a big deal in the state. Now, I'm a little concerned about some of this for a few reasons. One is like new state laws, like it's obvious that like some states now, for example, Texas and Florida have like very, very strict laws requiring cooperation. So like, and I heard in Florida, Ron DeSantis is proposing even stricter laws, so I don't know, I mean, his laws are crazy, he's proposing like crazy things, but who knows what will happen. And so it's very hard in some of those places, right, like there's limited resistance that like individual law enforcement can do. Thus far in North Carolina, like, it seems like it's still in play. One of the advantages to a federal system is the federal government cannot technically order local officials what to do. And a lot of governors have also said that, but I worry, so one is like new state laws. Two is like a lot of governors had said they would not cooperate, but then started like changing their mind. So like Eric Adams in New York was like, I'm not gonna cooperate with ICE, but then he was like, okay, maybe I will, because I don't know why. Cause he's like gonna get indicted, I guess, he's like, I don't wanna get in more trouble, for like various reasons, like to save their skin. It just feels like the Lake and Riley Act is very disappointing because a large number of Democrat legislators voted for it, even though it was bad. They knew it was bad and they did it anyway, which is like very disappointing. And I feel like there's this vibe right now where like people wanna say like, oh, we're gonna like figure out ways to cooperate with Trump rather than like directly opposing him. And that worries me a lot. Now, I don't know in North Carolina, like the governor hasn't said either way, so like I don't know like what the plan is. But it makes me worry that like some of these places may not resist as much. There's also this sort of wave, it hasn't been here, but there's a wave across the country of all these other laws to punish immigrants. So laws like Texas, for example, has a law like they are gonna ask people's immigration status if you go to like the doctor or the hospital. They wanna pass some laws that are like not allowing children to go to school, like not giving people benefits, like all these laws that are intended to be really punitive. Just make people, I mean, other than just make people feel bad and suffer, like, I don't really know. But it's all these laws just to like make people anxious and worried. And I've seen crazy ones, like one legislator proposed like a bounty bill that was like, I don't know, I mean, this seems like not allowed to me, but I don't know, like, there's like, he wants a bounty bill where you could call, like, it's like Mississippi or something, like, he's like, oh, you could get like $1,000. Yeah. For $1,000 for reporting. It's like, and now these have not been passed, but they're getting proposed and they're bonkers. Just to be clear, like, it's like, these are like bonkers bills. Tom Homan made a comment that he wanted a hotline. There actually is the funny thing is there is one, like you can call ICE. I mean, there is a hotline, it's like call ICE. I don't know how frequently people call it, but there is one. And there was one jurisdiction I was looking at in Michigan where the sheriff, they did a county law that they wanted the sheriff, this is what I'm a little concerned about because it feels less crazy. They wanted to track police contact with immigrants. So the idea was like they would keep track of like how many immigrants were arrested, how many they pulled over, how many they talked to as witnesses, etc. I thought that was sort of worrying because that's not a little less, like it seems like, oh, okay, they're just like collecting data. But obviously the reason for it was like, I mean, the reason for it is, I don't know, in case they want to go find, like, you know, they have this thing like, oh, we know the people to find, right? So it's like, seems like they're gonna track so they could find people. And when in that particular place, I like got FOIA'd emails, and what was happening was like, these like cuckoo people were emailing the sheriff being like, this next door neighbor seems, you know, like, this next door neighbor has a lot of people at their house. I think they're doing X, Y. So it was like reason to be like, yeah, kind of cuckoo stuff. Now it was so cuckoo, even that sheriff didn't do anything about it, but you know, this is the kind of thing, like it's inspiring people to do stuff like that. I think the main one, I mean, my main argument has been that like the main way to resist is just to like resist all kinds of criminalization and arrests. If people aren't pulled over, then they're less likely to get deported. If we don't have a roadblock, people are less likely to get deported. If we have fewer cops in schools, kids are less likely to get harassed and deported. Like just getting police out of areas, especially sensitive areas like hospitals, like I said, hospitals, schools, churches, all these places, courthouses. Like we don't need cops in those places and we don't want people getting arrested. I don't know, what do you think? Do you have a thought? Oh.
I guess on those lines, I was wondering, so if the police are already in those places and we're trying to get to a place where they're not as much in those places, I know that here there's been a lot of activism around observing police interactions with folks, particularly in undocumented or Latin communities. I know that during the first Trump administration, there were people following around the ICE vans and witnessing and embarrassing them. I wonder if you could talk about, either of you talk about, successful instances where, that pushback has occurred in a popular grassroots manner that you've heard of either here or elsewhere.
So the question was about sort of, I guess I would call it like popular resistance. I was thinking of the airports where people showed up in the Muslim ban, like community and popular resistance. Do you have one? Yes, okay, good.
Especialmente yo todavía no era parte de CIMA, pero escuché y vi porque era parte de la comunidad también. CIMA, compañeros voluntarios como Patty, Andrea, que fueron quienes realmente estaban siguiendo los carros de migración, fueron incluso a Henderson cuando migración estaba teniendo su luncher, después de haber arrestado a una cantidad de personas, porque en ese entonces estuvieron aquí como poco más de una semana. Y eso ayudó a la comunidad a dar calma porque podían ver a través de las redes de dónde estaba migración. Les daba un poquito más de tranquilidad de saber que podían ir a la tienda a comprar algo. CIMA como tal tiene un grupo de verificadores que son voluntarios, que cuando empiezan a esparcirse los rumores de que llegó migración, para no crear más pánico, lo que hacemos es, recibimos una llamada de alguien que cree que migración está en esta dirección. Hay alguien cerca que puede ir a verificar. Los verificadores obviamente tienen que tener un documento, ya sea ciudadano o residentes, porque pueden acercarse a la policía o a la persona en cuestión y preguntar, oye, estoy preocupado por mi comunidad. ¿Podrías explicarme qué es lo que estás haciendo? ¿Estás buscando a una persona? Y se clarifica el rumor. Si es verdad, pues se manda un mensaje a la comunidad. Si no es verdad, también se manda el mensaje a la comunidad para dar esa tranquilidad de esto solamente fue un rumor. Hubo una ocasión hace como 2 años en donde alguien de los que cazan, bueno, son cazarrecompensas, los que buscan a quienes, sí, ¿no? Cazarrecompensas, bounty. Ajá. Llegaron a un parqueadero y la gente obviamente se empezó a asustar. Yo vivía en ese parqueadero y una vecina me llama y me dice, oye, creo que migración está 3 casas de donde tú vives. Y entonces se le pidió a la persona que fuera a verificar, a preguntar. Dijo, oye, yo soy parte de esta comunidad. Me gustaría saber qué estás haciendo aquí. ¿Cuáles son tus credenciales? Y él dijo, no, yo no soy ICE, pero estamos buscando a esta persona porque no se presentó a su corte y ahora tenemos que agarrarlo para llevarlo. Entonces, todas estas acciones dan tranquilidad a la comunidad, pero también le hacen saber a ICE que su trabajo va a ser mucho más difícil porque los están viendo por si rompen las leyes. Claro que ellos violan los derechos humanos de las personas a las que detienen. Que por cierto vamos a tener, aprovecho para hacer un comercial. CIMA vamos a tener un taller de verificadores para quienes quieran agregarse y ser parte voluntaria como verificador. Este enero 25 y la dirección se las puedo dar, va a ser de 11 a 1. Tenemos interpretación y también cuidado de niños para quien lo necesite.
Okay. I was just thinking I have to get the date. I was thinking of another one, so in Texas, this is during Trump 1, there was a community outside of Austin, there's like a primarily Latinx community, it was a lot of people who worked in construction in Austin. And so they set up, so the sheriff there set up a checkpoint, it was a rural community, it was sort of like one road, and then there was a gas station and a Dollar General, so there's a lot of people coming home from work who would stop and pick up stuff and then go home. So they were setting up a checkpoint there and stopping people without driver's licenses and then arresting them and taking them to jail. And interestingly, a few things happened. So one was that they were all from Mexico, they called the Mexican consulate. It's a little interesting because the consulate, one of the issues that will happen is the relationship with the Mexican consulate. So they called the Mexican consulate and said, and he went to the jail and said, why are there so many people here who are Mexican citizens? And then also a lot of the people, similarly, a lot of people in the community went to the sheriff and told him to stop. So it was a lot of them were children, so like citizen children of people in the community went to the sheriff, and told him to stop. That they were watching it, they didn't, to stop this checkpoint. And then between the two pressure, like the consulate pressure and people telling him to stop, he didn't do it. The next time he tried to do it, similarly to what you were saying, everybody flooded the internet and said, he set up this checkpoint here, don't go, and then it was online, and so he just sort of looked bad, everybody.
Just remembered another one.
Yes.
That's a good one.
Okay, good.
Acabo de recordar uno que no fue aquí en Carolina del Norte, pero que fue en el estado vecino, en donde no había una organización como tal, pero hubo una persona, de hecho estuvo en las noticias, no sé si ustedes recuerden, alguien iba rumbo al trabajo en una van, se subió y entonces la gente de migración se les acercó. La persona no se bajó, pero de repente empezaron a llegar vecinos y después personas de las iglesias y rodearon la van de la persona que iba a ser detenida por ICE y estuvieron ahí por horas. ICE terminó cansándose, las personas que estaban rodeando la van hicieron un camino en cadena hacia la puerta de la casa de las dos personas que estaban en la van y pudieron entrar a su casa. Entonces, ICE se quedó con las manos vacías y muy enojados porque la comunidad se presentó y dijo, no te los vas a llevar y aquí nos vamos a quedar y a ver quién se cansa primero. Y esos son el tipo de acciones que necesitan ser recordadas porque ahí es cuando la solidaridad y la unidad hace el poder y podemos todos juntos coexistir y decir, oye, no va a ser tan fácil para ti llevártelos, ¿no? Y eso hace que también, bueno, queremos creer que hay si se usa. Esto nos va a costar trabajo.
And it's true, you can count on them getting tired. I was thinking, the people who fought Joe Arpaio did much the same, right? They surrounded the buses and blocked them from leaving.
I have a question about the verifiers, like when people get information back from the cops, people are talking to the cops, what are you doing here? How often do y'all see that the cops are actually telling the truth about what they're doing to a random person who's just driving through the checkpoint?
Quiero decir que ha dependido del departamento que es, porque a veces han sido policías y a veces han sido state troopers. Creo que la mayoría de las veces han dicho la verdad, ya sea porque puedo recordar el caso, hace unos meses state troopers estaban haciendo un retén y en este caso iban a quitar el carro a la persona a la que habían acabado de detener por no tener licencia. Una de nuestras verificadoras se acercó. No conocía a la persona que estaba siendo detenida, pero le dijo, hey, yo te cubro. Se acercó el policía y le dijo, oye, mira, es mi familiar. Yo me voy a llevar su carro. Porque tú sabes lo que cuesta irla a sacar de allí y luego pagar diario. No, yo me lo llevo. Terminaron por soltar a la persona porque llegaron más verificadores. Y lo único que sucedió ahí es, ya le dieron su ticket a la persona y dijo, ok, pues si ya tienes quien te lleve, te van a llevar tu carro. Sí puedes tener la interacción y creo que se sienten más obligados cuando llegan más personas y empiezan a grabar. Claro, no queremos estorbar para no darles el pretexto de llevarnos arrestados, pero sí hemos visto que es más exitoso de esa manera. Cuando hay más personas de testigos.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the role of like far right ideology, particularly among sheriffs. And I realize that this might not be super pertinent to Buncombe County where we are, but you did mention that there's increasingly kind of a rightward trajectory among law enforcement as a whole, but maybe sheriffs in particular.
Sure, so the question was about far right ideology and sheriffs. What, so this is like a lot of the book, so a great deal of the book I spent talking about these far right groups. So I think that a lot of people would not be what most people have seen, right, that there are a lot of far right groups who have become more active, particularly before Trump, particularly during Trump 1, but particularly who were activated around COVID. So what I saw was a lot of particularly sheriffs kind of reanimating a lot of these older far right organizations that were not as popular or had been kind of limited to places like the Pacific Northwest or specific areas. And during COVID, it just became a much bigger thing. And the thing about some of these far right, they're basically far right groups that work with law enforcement. And there's a few different ones. Now, some of them, what a lot of them do that is alarming is they do what's called a law enforcement training. So they get sheriffs and deputies and like-minded people together and then talk to them. And so it's an ideological training. And not like a training like, oh, here's what you do, you know, when you fill out like a ticket or whatever. Like, it's not like how to do paperwork. It's like an ideological training of like, actually your job is to make sure you enforce the Constitution. And, you know, this is sort of enforcing the Constitution as aligned with like the way most FAR groups are. There's not a whole lot of difference between like what they think. I mean, just being frank, like they don't think any different. It's like extremely xenophobic. It's very in favor of civilian ownership of guns. It's exactly. It's very much like interested in white supremacy. They don't really call it always white supremacy. I sometimes call it just like civil rights for white guys. Like it's how because they'll sort of say like, oh, it's like civil rights. So it's just like civil rights for white people. You know, anti-abortion, they all just believe the same thing. So they're teaching them basically to, you know, before the idea was like to teach law enforcement to look for communists. This is where it comes from. So they would teach law enforcement like to ferret out the communists in your community and like arrest them, find them in the schools, etc. And this is sort of the same thing that got revised. Now, right now, some of the things I'm the most concerned about is some of the think tanks are getting involved and they just have more money. So the Claremont Institute has been training specifically sheriffs. They're also training some cops. Hillsdale College, which is like a sort of like conservative Christian college, is also doing some cop training. And Claremont Institute is particularly worrisome because they're like virulently xenophobic. Like they want to get rid of birthright citizenship. One of their readings was basically to say, oh, we should declare like a military invasion against I don't know who, cartels, I suppose, and then that would give them permission to like shoot people crossing the US-Mexico border. I mean, like I said, virulently racist, oppose all immigration in all forms. So like they would just deport everybody, I guess. And so that's like alarming because that's really, I mean, they have the ear of the Trump administration. I mean, this is like Stephen Miller style stuff. But they're also like training cops and training sheriffs, which, you know, I find worrisome. I find it worrisome that they're, you know, I think the only one around here they've trained is Craven County, North Carolina. I think he's pretty well, like that's for a lot of, you know, probably not surprising. Most of the people they train are like not a surprise. Like it's people that I'm like, oh yeah, that tracks. It's also a lot of people, you know, in 2020, when there were a lot of protests for racial justice and sort of like Black Lives Matter oriented protests, that really made, I don't know what the right way to say, it, really made a lot of like sheriffs and police officers really mad. It really got their goat in essence. And that has like, that sort of rage, and there was like an immediate clapback, right? It's always, the clapback is always like 3 times as hard as the ask. So the ask was like, stop shooting people. And then the clapback was like, no, we're just gonna shoot more. Which is true, like shootings have gone up, so police shootings have gone up. One thing of note in particular is actually rural police shootings, especially by sheriffs, has gone up. So we do see like right now that there is like a particular problem in more rural areas. But they're training them in this ideology, but it's also spreading because, you know, Trump has promised sort of like immunity for violence. Yeah, this idea that like you can assault people. I mean, you know, it's, again, police are unaccountable anyway. Like, I don't want to say they were ever accountable in various ways. They were always unaccountable. ICE, and I would agree, ICE agents in particular, like very, very unaccountable. Customs and Border Patrol, again, a very unaccountable group. They hurt, I mean, they hurt people all the time, kill people all the time. But this is sort of like really motivated them to shift to the right. And, you know, some of it is just like their efforts to paint Democrats as like defund the police, which I always think is funny because like Democrats never defunded the police. I mean, they really like literally never defunded the police, but it's like they painted everyone on the left is like defund the police, like we're all like abolitionists and we're taking over everything, and that's why like there's all these problems in society. And so the clapback has been like particularly harsh. I think that's why we see like all this like really harsh criminalization, is because of this like idea that, you know, again, someone like spit in someone's Starbucks cup and they'll never be forgiven. Whatever. Did you have anything to add? Okay, yeah.
Do you think a left-wing militia group such as the SRA or Redneck Revolt would help provide community defense, or would that cause more harm than help?
I don't have a really strong opinion on it. I do think that they're definitely under the eye of the Trump administration, because he kind of, like, a lot of these laws they're passing that are criminalizing nonprofits. This is sort of like lightly aside from, but they have these laws, right? They're trying to make laws that basically criminalize nonprofits who do things like help, like, and some of them are these groups that like help immigrants who are like crossing the US-Mexico border. And other, I think, kind of left-wing, all the left-wing groups, anyone who's like helping protesters, like protest genocide and all this stuff. So I do think there's like an eye on them, and that they want to view them as basically like national security threats. We're sort of getting a new like security, like the security state apparatus is coming back. And so because they're viewing them as security threats, I think they're going to be more watchful. I think that, well, I agree with your opinion. My opinion, honestly, is like community support is always good as long as it's like, the problem with police is like it always has to look like really, really non-violent. Like it has to be like community support always helps, but it has, just because we're dealing with the police and we don't want people getting hurt. That it always has to just look like non-violent. I mean, it's not totally I'm not telling anyone what to do or not to do, let's put it that way. I don't know how the police, but I think if you're in a situation where like there are vulnerable people, like people in danger of getting like arrested and deported or whatever, like what you don't want is you don't want any excuse for cops to like pull out guns, because then like people will, like innocent people will get with people. I don't know if you have other thoughts.
I agree 100%.
Oh, yeah.
This might be kind of far out, but do you see a reality in which you were talking about like they're kind of turning it into like a national security issue? Do you see a reality in which they could possibly declare a national emergency to kind of like keep the resistance at bay and sort of like divide and conquer?
So one of the, well, okay, I'll say like a law thing, and then like we're huge about things. So the law thing is, when they declare an emergency, it doesn't mean anything lawless. Like, just to be clear, that you can declare like all the emergencies you want, and it doesn't change laws. Like, people still have rights, and like, it's not like free. It's not like, oh, I declare an emergency and everyone can just go like buck wild and do whatever they want. So, so like, that's like the law thing, is like, you can declare, like, people declare emergencies, it doesn't mean anything, and it doesn't mean that you can just like run around arresting and deporting people. Okay, so that's like the law thing, so like, that said, I do think there's like energy to do it, right? So there's a variety of ways. I heard Stephen Miller wants to return like Title 42, which means he wants to find like some sort of disease that he can say is like a reason to like close the US Mexico border. He's looking desperately. All of a sudden, they're interested in health. They did it. They did. Joe Arpaio used swine flu to argue against, like, so they did it. So who knows? I don't know. So there's that. There's ideas that they'll like declare cartels like foreign threats so that they can, I guess, do something. I mean, I don't. It's already like cartels are already illegal. Like I'm always like, drug possession and sales are already illegal. It's not, there's nothing new there. I mean, I guess envisioning something like the way they do like gang, I don't know that they do it as much here, but in some places like gang databases and tracking gang members is like a really big deal, and it gets a lot of particularly young people in trouble. I do think that said that the administration seems very intent on criminalizing immigrants, particularly what I see is like young men. They seem very intent on criminalizing young men and teenage boys as like members of gangs, to argue that like they are, troublemakers, etc. They've been prepping the groundwork. People are always, I think, saying there's sort of this like interesting idea that like they're not, they talk about like the military age men who are immigrating, like to sort of generate fear, that these are people who are like in some way, and it's true, like when they show people, mugshots of people who are dangerous, they try to show dangerous people, they always show like young men. And that's just like one of the stereotypes that they use to sort of generate like a great deal of fear and anxiety. Of course, like young men have families and they have families and children and mothers and fathers. So like everybody is part of a family. So it's not like, they're outside of like a family structure, but I think that that's like, if you remember the MS-13 like panic where they like a whole lot of teenage boys were like cast as members of MS-13.
I was gonna say it's so emblematic of like this like fantastical creature in the white mind of like a grimacing like savage that they used against Black people for so long.
Yes, I mean, and immigrants too. This is like, for a long time, even back, this is just me being historical, but like back in the days when the US was expanding its empire west, they cast, especially places like Arizona and the desert, as sort of foreign, scary, mean, the people were like extra, sort of like the environment was harsh, so the people had to be like meaner. Like the snakes are meaner and the lizards are meaner and the people are meaner, right? And sometimes you see, I feel like every time I see this B-roll footage of people crossing the US-Mexico border, right? They always make it look like really menacing. Especially like if y'all remember when the Haitians were crossing, like there's this goal to make like, and again, particularly, it's always the US-Mexico border. And it's always that, it's right, it's a particular border, it's a particular people, it's people with darker skin that they use to like really make people look scary and criminal. And I mean, that's just part of their propaganda campaign. That is, but the propaganda campaign, look, it works, and it makes people pass like crazy laws, and it makes people act crazy and call the cops on their neighbors and all these things. So I mean, I do think this is like, we also have sort of are living in this like prime, like vigilante snitch culture. Like Texas has like the bounty law on women seeking abortion care. And I think that, you know, we're living in this prime time of like vigilante culture where like we're encouraging people to like take the law into their own hands. And so like, if you see something, say something, right? Like, and so that's why I worry about that a lot, is like the propaganda inspires a lot of people to be afraid, but then also like, those are the people who call the police and call law enforcement as like a sort of, I mean, my sort of pitch sometimes for talking to law enforcement, especially if you're a citizen, is that I'll tell you what, like all the white supremacists are talking to law enforcement all the time. Like they call them all the time. And so I'm like, well, you know what, if you don't talk to law enforcement or call the sheriff and ask them what they're doing, the only people calling them are like right-wing white supremacists. And so not to say that like there's reasons why they're calling them, but like if you don't call them, like that's all they hear from. And so they don't hear from like, I'm not saying that they will listen all the time, but they're politicians and like ICE agents are lazy. They don't want to be like, this is, you know, I guess my theory is usually if you make it uncomfortable enough, you can get them to change their mind. But you have to hit the threshold of like what's uncomfortable enough that they'll give up or say, okay, fine, we're not gonna do this thing.
Solamente quería hacer énfasis en lo que Jessica acababa de decir. Quizá la milicia ya había estado exactamente entre la frontera de México y Estados Unidos, pero veo más como esa influencia que esta 2.0 va a tener en cuanto a generar más odio en aquellos que ya de por sí nos odiaban y se van a sentir con el poder suficiente de dañar o lastimar, o como decía Jessica, tomar por su propia mano la ley y aplicarla según su propia forma de pensar. Y eso es quizá para mí lo más alarmante, porque sabemos que en esta nueva gobierno que viene, le gusta hablar mucho y mucho y mucho y esparcir mucho odio y separar no solamente a la comunidad inmigrante de la comunidad blanca, sino a negros, a personas de la comunidad LGBTQ, simplemente de separar y de crear todos los que no son igual a la forma en la que él piensa, están completamente mal y entonces tienes que ir contra ellos. Y eso es mucho más dañino que incluso tener a la milicia aquí.
And we're at 90 minutes, so if you want to maybe take one more and then we'll wrap.
Okay, we're just hitting the time, so. Oh, I'm gonna ask that person, I can talk to you after.
It wasn't a question, actually, it was
Oh,
just
okay.
a response.
I just love the way back there.
Yes, there are a few of us in here from far east Tennessee. We're getting a lot of immigration from the West Coast, so we're getting lots of like neo-Nazi compounds and right-wing religious fundamentalist armed compounds, and also getting a lot of constitutional sheriffs and their ties with militias. Do you have anything to say about like the militia connection with right-wing sheriffs growing in this area?
So the question was about right-wing sheriffs and militias and the constitutional sheriff movement. I'm like, it's bad. So it actually, this is what I spent a lot of time with in the book. The constitutional sheriff movement is interesting because there are people who are, so there's a formal organization, right? The Constitutional Sheriff and Peace Officer Association. But I actually think the bigger issue is not necessarily the organization itself, but it's sort of outsized influence on politics writ large. So, you know, one of the things that there's definitely an influx, especially in Western North Carolina. Yes, they have tried to make inroads. There's a lot of people, there's like parts of Tennessee and Western North Carolina where like there's a few people, right-wing militias, of course, in the wake of the hurricane. There's like this militia guy bopping around. which I'm, there's like this guy sort of bopping around. And they're sort of attracted to like disaster. I mean, there's also always this like Western North Carolina, like Appalachian thing that people get very enchanted with. Like I always am like, cause it's like sort of like the original white homeland, and so people get sort of like. So militia groups get very like attracted to the idea of like, this is where the like magical whites live. And so if we go, there's like, you know, there's, I don't know, they have this like idea of the people there. And I think the thing I don't wanna go too much into it, because it would take me like I could talk about a very, very long time. I could talk to you after. I think the thing to bear in mind is that their influence has been very much to erode norms around what kind of violence is acceptable, right? So in terms of militias, like what militias are very effective at is like eroding the norms. So I think of a lot of these trials, Daniel Penny in New York, right? He killed the guy in the subway. Another trial I thought a lot about that probably you hear about less here is there was a rancher in Arizona who shot an immigrant on his property. He was also acquitted. So, you know, we just see this idea again of people sort of, they think they're police, right? This is these guys. They think they're police, they're doing the job of police, and they're shooting people because they believe that that's what police do and that's what they should be doing also. So like, I find that deeply disconcerting. The other thing that's worrisome about the constitutional sheriff movement is how much they've been able to create an idea that sheriffs in particular don't have to follow laws or are unaccountable. It's not true, but a lot of state legislators believe it and a lot of federal officials believe it. So again, if you got like the 90 sheriffs in North Carolina lobby the state legislature for laws or lobby against laws that might hold them accountable, with little ones there are. The sheriffs will say like, oh, you can't hold us accountable because we're elected and we're very special. And so we get to do what I want. Now, what I would say is they get to do what they want until North Carolina voted for a handful of black sheriffs. And then all of a sudden the rest of them were like, oh no, we're definitely gonna tell them what to do. We definitely don't want them doing what they want. So it's very much a one-way street. Like if people want to be more punitive, more violent, that's fine. But if they want to be less punitive, less violent, you know, the people say, well, we can't have that. And that's what I worry a lot about, is the influence to make it really hard for people who want to be less punitive, right? Make it really hard for sheriffs who want more accountability or want to be different. It makes it hard. I mean, which is what I will say about the Buncombe County Sheriff here, which is good, is that he just doesn't say much, which is probably a good thing. I say it's better just to keep your mouth shut and not talk to the media and just do things. Because it's easier to do things quietly. Because then he has the ability, let's say, if people start getting arrested and transferred to ICE, if he's quiet, you have the ability to he can quietly release people, right? But he doesn't want to make a big deal because he'll get, you know, like the clapback will be louder, right? So what you want is like communities to talk to law enforcement and try to mitigate the damage, but you really don't want them in the public eye, in my opinion, but. Well, we've hit 90 minutes. I'll be around a little bit after if people want to ask me stuff. Or if you want to frequent the store, purchase things from the store. And I want to thank Liberty of Firestorm. Thank you. Thank you for coming. Thank you, Nina. Thank you, translators. Thank you so much for this. I am very grateful we have the ability to do English and Spanish, so thank you guys so much.
Thank you.